let us continue to study the suffering of everything composite, one of the three fundamental types of suffering. It says in the text that our food and tea are linked to many negative actions. This does not mean we must stop drinking tea or eating tsampa and rice, nor does it imply that a true practitioner must starve themselves to death. Great Tibetan masters such as Shabkar Tsoktruk Ngöndro, 1781 to 1851, also explain the merits of clean food. So it is acceptable to eat and drink. The key is to understand that food and drink are associated with many negative actions that are unknown to many. Eminent masters have praised clean food. Take tea, for example. When Venerable Atisha came to Tibet, he spoke highly of tea, stating that it can improve health, refresh the mind, and dispel drowsiness. Atisha also claimed that tea from China was akin to celestial nectar, making it an excellent offering to the three jewels. According to historical accounts, Atisha sent tea leaves as a precious gift to Indian masters and friends. Similarly, many eminent masters of Chinese Buddhism advocated for tea culture and integrated it into Chan Buddhism. Thus, you can see how special tea is. There are indeed harmful actions associated with tea. As mentioned in the root text, during the growing phase on plantations, insects are killed, and during the bartering phase, cheating and arguments occur. However, if we tea drinkers do not harbor intentions of killing or cheating, we will not commit significant faults. For instance, if a person drinking tea has neither the thought nor the action of killing insects, according to the sutras, they bear no fault of killing. No sutra states that if you engage in actions that indirectly result in the death of living beings, you must bear all the faults and consequences of the killing. Our daily activities unconsciously involve many misdeeds, but as long as we live in this world, such occurrences are inevitable. Therefore, it is unrealistic to expect that none of our actions involve misdeeds. According to Master Xuanhua, it is unavoidable for ordinary people to step on ants and insects and inadvertently kill them while walking. Only noble beings like arhats can walk without their feet touching the ground, thus avoiding the death of insects. In this world, food and drink that do not involve harmful actions cannot be found anywhere. Nevertheless, we should not become indifferent to these issues. Instead, we should care about all that lies behind them and strive to dedicate merit to the living beings involved. For example, every morning when we wake up, we should think, whoever is involved with my food and clothing, and whoever I encounter today, may they attain benefits in their mind stream. If we practice in this way with the guidance of bodhicitta, all our actions, walking, sitting, lying down, and so on, will become sources of merit, propelling us further along the path to enlightenment. This is extremely important for a practitioner. Next, Patrul Rinpoche uses the example of tsampa, the indispensable food for Tibetans, to further analyze the suffering of everything composite. Tsampa, a type of cooked highland barley flour, is the staple food for Tibetans, just as rice and noodles are for Han people in China. Barley typically grows in regions between 3,200 and 3,800 meters above sea level. Highland barley does not yield well at altitudes below 3,200 meters or above 3,800 meters. The altitude of Larangar exceeds 3,800 meters, and the pagoda of the mandala at our Buddhist institute is at 4,000 meters. Therefore, we are unable to grow highland barley here. Even if someone plants it, the crop does not yield well. Many eminent masters have praised tsampa. For example, Geshe Chengawa said, "The only indispensable food for practitioners is tsampa." When asked by someone, "What is the panacea for this world?" the renowned doctor replied, "Tsampa." Additionally, a master remarked, "Tsampa can help expel the cold from the body and enhance wisdom." According to historical accounts, tsampa is the food that Avalokiteshvara specifically blessed and bestowed upon Tibetans. So anyone who eats it will eventually give rise to great compassion. No one has ever reported contracting food poisoning after eating tsampa, nor has a Tibetan doctor ever forbidden patients from consuming it. Some experts have discovered that tsampa has remarkable benefits for our health and longevity. Recently, empirical studies have shown that in China, there are an average of 6.4 centenarians per 1 million people. However, in the Tibetan region, the rate is 44 centenarians, which is significantly higher than the average. A reason Tibetans have so many more centenarians despite living at a high altitude with low oxygen levels may be their frequent consumption of tsampa. Compared to meat and fish, tsampa is undoubtedly a clean food. However, when discussing the suffering of everything composite, Patrul Rinpoche reminds us that tsampa also involves various harmful actions. Here is Patrul Rinpoche's argument. Before the barley can be sown, the fields must be plowed. Worms and insects from underground are forced to the surface, while surface creatures are buried below. Wherever the plowing oxen tread, they are followed by crows and small birds, eagerly feeding on these displaced creatures. When the fields are irrigated, aquatic animals are left stranded on dry ground, while terrestrial creatures are drowned. At every stage, sowing, harvesting, and threshing, countless lives are lost. Given all this, it is almost as though we are consuming powdered insects. Someone may think, since Patrul Rinpoche says eating tsampa is almost as if eating powdered insects, there is no difference between adopting a vegetarian diet and eating meat. But such an argument is baseless. The phrase "almost as if" is used to convey the idea that while tsampa is associated with certain misdeeds, it does not mean that eating a bowl of tsampa is equivalent to eating a bowl of powdered insects. Shopkart Sokdruk Ngöndro also stated, eating powdered insects is very different from eating tsampa. Eating tsampa brings a practitioner health and longevity and enables them to perform many virtuous deeds. When the practitioner is in good health, the 21,000 parasites residing in their digestive system will also thrive. During the planting of highland barley, some living beings like insects are killed, but even if they are not, they will freeze to death in winter. As long as you do not intentionally kill the insects, the fault is not significant. However, there is still a minor fault involved. Therefore, when we enjoy food in our daily lives, we should dedicate merit to all beings connected to our food, wishing for their freedom from suffering and the attainment of happiness. By doing so, the merit will far outweigh the fault. Whatever we are doing, we should evaluate whether it creates more merit or more faults. If you blindly believe you should not consume any tsampa, tea, or butter, and you starve yourself to death, the fault will be much greater. Nowhere in any sutra does the Buddha suggest that all practitioners should starve themselves to death. The reason Patrul Rinpoche discusses the faults of food is to remind us that our practice should be guided by mindfulness and vigilance. Otherwise, we will have to repay many karmic debts. I once read a verse inscribed on the wall of a Chinese Buddhist temple that said, "1 grain of rice from a donor is as large as Mount Meru. If you don't practice diligently, you will have to repay with your own furs and horns." This verse aligns with the guidance provided by various Tibetan masters. We should always make recitations and dedicate the merit to the donors during our practice. We should appreciate the donors' offerings and never regard them as insignificant or dispensable. Past eminent masters of both Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism especially cherished their good fortune. They cherished food and always dedicated the merit for the offerings they received. Otherwise, the improper use of donors' offerings may lead to rebirth as a horse or a cow, forcing one to repay karmic debts with one's own body. Hence, we should study the law of karma. Through study, we will become aware of different perspectives, allowing us to analyze the ultimate secret meaning of each instruction. By doing so, your practice will not go astray. Otherwise, upon hearing the faults related to tsampa and tea, you may find yourself eating or drinking nothing. There is no need for this. Therefore, when practicing the Dharma, we should first understand the extraordinary intentions of the eminent masters. Only in this way can we grasp the secret meanings of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. In the same way, butter, milk, and other foods, often referred to as the 3 white foods and 3 sweet foods, are traditionally viewed as pure and untainted by harmful actions. However, this perception is far from accurate. Most baby yaks, calves, and lambs are killed, while those who survive face a harsh reality. Shortly after birth, before they even have a chance to taste their mother's sweet and nourishing milk, they are tied with ropes around their necks, either tethered to stakes during rest stops or bound together during travel. This ensures that every drop of milk, their rightful nourishment, is taken away to produce butter and cheese. The Tibetan eminent masters spoke extensively about the merits and virtues of consuming butter. However, I will skip this topic since butter is currently quite expensive, and if I discuss it too much, while you may not be able to afford it, it might make you a little sad. By extracting essential vitality from the mother's body, which is crucial for the baby, we leave them halfway between life and death. Herdsmen understand this very well, but Dharma students raised in Han areas may not be fully aware of it. In some Tibetan regions, people are engaging in a distressing practice. Calves are killed as soon as they are born, so that households can continuously obtain milk from the unfortunate mother yaks throughout the summer. Even when some calves are not killed, they are deprived of access to their mother's milk. Compared to humans, these animals lead a very miserable life. A few herdsmen who believe in the law of karma strive to find balance in everything, ensuring they do not harm the calves while obtaining milk. By doing so, they avoid committing significant wrongs. Some farmers in Han areas neither steal nor deliberately kill. They grow crops through diligent work, making the food they consume essentially fault-free. Even if there are minor faults involved, these can be purified through reciting mantras and dedicating merit. Next is about the mother yaks. When spring arrives, the aged mother animals grow so frail that they can no longer rise from their stalls. During this season, the grass has not yet grown, and the winter hay has run out, leaving the poor mother yaks unable to nourish themselves and causing them to become quite weak. Thus, a financial crisis for yaks occurs in the spring. The cattle become extremely emaciated, especially when heavy snow covers all the grass on the ground, resulting in many yaks and calves starving to death. The survivors, frail and emaciated, shuffle around on the brink of death. They are so skinny that they resemble the stirring sticks Tibetans use for roasting highland barley in a wok. In the spring, when the calves appear skeletal, herdsmen comment, "It looks like a stirring stick. It might not survive the spring." This simile is commonly used in the Tibetan region to describe skinny livestock. It may be difficult for you to understand. When I was in middle school, our textbooks included many similes and analogies from the Han areas of China. Our Chinese teacher, a Han Chinese, taught enthusiastically, but we struggled to comprehend much of it. Despite his best efforts, we had little understanding of what he was conveying. Perhaps this was due to differences in culture and traditions. It is said that some Gelugpa geshes had trouble understanding certain similes in the words of my perfect teacher. As for stowing sticks, I once made them myself. As a child in a herdsman family, I was able to handle most household chores, including making butter, ghee, and roasting barley. If you give me a piece of cloth, and a stick, I can quickly make you a stirring stick. All the things we currently associate with happiness, such as having food to eat, clothes to wear, and any other goods or materials we can think of, are also the result of negative actions. Therefore, even goods associated with a seemingly pure life can be directly or indirectly linked to harmful actions when examined by noble beings such as arhats, not to mention actual misdeeds. Anuruddha, the arhat foremost in divine vision, once looked at a glass of water and, through his clairvoyance, discovered innumerable living beings within it, so he dared not drink. Later, the Buddha advised him not to rely on his arhat clairvoyance, but to use his naked eyes instead, determining what to do and what not to do accordingly. The record of the Vinaya for daily use in Chinese Buddhism also states, the Buddha sees 84,000 living creatures in a bowl of water. Without reciting this mantra, drinking water is akin to consuming the flesh of beings. Therefore, before drinking water, monastics are required to recite the Ratnasiki mantra, Om Va Swaramani Swaha, to avoid any faults. With advancements in science and technology, instruments have helped verify the presence of many bacteria in a glass of water. However, more than 2,000 years ago, the Buddha and many sublime ones had already perceived this. So is there any fault in drinking water? The Buddha taught that as long as we do not see any living beings with our naked eyes and do not intentionally wish to harm them, there will be no fault. Otherwise, countless things remain invisible to our eyes, including dark matter, which is believed to account for approximately 68% of the matter in the universe. Therefore, our decisions about what to do versus what not to do should be based on what we can perceive with our naked eyes. Otherwise, the faults we commit would be countless. Karma is related to the mind. According to Mahayana scriptures, it can be categorized into non-transferable actions, non-meritorious actions, and meritorious actions, all of which stem from ignorance. Thus, karma is closely linked to our conceptual thoughts. Without the mind fabricating thoughts, unintentional non-meritorious actions do not become the root cause of falling into the lower realms. We must be clear about these issues. To emphasize the suffering of everything composite, eminent masters repeatedly remind us that behind every seeming pleasure lies a multitude of negative actions. The ultimate consequence of these actions can only lead to the endless suffering of the lower realms. Thus, it is necessary that we recognize the truths of all conditioned things are impermanent, all tainted things are suffering, and the threefold world is like a burning house. However, many people struggle to accept that everything is suffering in the three realms. In particular, some worldly successful individuals often believe they are living a fantastic and happy life free of pain. Yet, they do not recognize that everything that seems to represent happiness today is in fact the suffering of everything composite. They simply have not yet experienced this suffering. When we examine everything through the lens of wisdom, we come to realize that nothing is free from the nature of suffering. The above commentary addresses the final one of the three fundamental types of suffering: the suffering of everything composite, the sufferings of birth, sickness, old age, and death. Regarding the 8 streams of suffering, there are extensive descriptions in the Sutra of the 5 Kings. The Chinese Tripitaka contains many canonical collections, but sadly, many of them are collecting dust on bookshelves, with only a handful of people truly learned in the canons. When I meet lay practitioners and Dharma masters, I find that some can only mention a few sutras, and beyond these, they do not study the sutras extensively. The same is true in the Tibetan region, where the Buddhist canon is divided into the Kangyur and Tengyur, which together comprise more than 300 volumes. Except for a select few eminent masters and geshes, Hardly anyone regularly reads the canonical collections, let alone being learned in them. Some Buddhists are devout, but if you ask them, what are the 8 streams of suffering, which sutra covers those clearly, many cannot provide an answer. In fact, many concepts presented in the words of my perfect teacher can be found in the Tripitaka. The Buddhist canon has already been translated into Chinese, but I wonder how many Buddhists are truly learned about the Buddhist teachings. Once, I met a renowned Dharma master of Chinese Buddhism who believed that what Patrul Rinpoche included in the words of my perfect teacher is only relevant to Tibetan customs and traditions and has no connection to Chinese Buddhism. I used the practice of the 7-branch offering as an example to demonstrate that the teachings in the words of my perfect teacher are consistent with those in the Tripitaka. It seemed that the Dharma master had not yet read through the Tripitaka. Had he done so, he would have realized that aside from a few examples from India and the Tibetan region, the words of my perfect teacher is very much in harmony with the Tripitaka. Therefore, the words of my perfect teacher is not merely a collection of Tibetan traditions. If you have the time and energy, I hope you will consider studying the Tripitaka. In particular, young Buddhists living in urban areas can easily access the canonical collections through the internet. However, some people may be too preoccupied with trivial matters to read sutras. Nevertheless, I hope those fortunate Dharma students can still find a way to read through the canon and thoughtfully contemplate its teachings. This time, when I teach you the common preliminaries, I do not expect you to have an extraordinary understanding of the theories. Instead, I hope you can carefully and diligently contemplate and meditate on each instruction and the content of each class. In terms of content, there is nothing difficult to understand. As long as the tutor reads the instruction once, you can incorporate it into your meditation practice. In fact, the sufferings of birth, sickness, old age, and death are easy to understand. If you find it challenging to put them into meditation practice, you might consider visiting a hospital, which is an ideal place to witness birth, sickness, old age, and death. It was after witnessing scenes of sickness, old age, birth, and death during his excursions beyond the palace gates that Buddha Shakyamuni generated renunciation. He realized that even as a prince, he could not escape death and the suffering of samsara. So he left the palace, practiced diligently in a secluded place, and eventually attained Buddhahood. Many monastics at Larung Gar chose to forego everything and take ordination because they recognized that life is short and trivialities are boundless. However, some monastics may not yet possess the same level of renunciation. As for lay practitioners, even if you do not have the opportunity to take ordination, you should strive to develop a deep understanding of the sufferings of birth, sickness, old age, and death. Then you should contemplate them repeatedly. In fact, everyone is capable of reflecting on these sufferings. It is just that many people choose not to. If you do not engage in this reflection, you may never progress to a higher state of practice. The suffering of birth. For humans in this world, birth occurs from the womb. Humans can actually experience 4 types of birth: birth from the womb, birth from an egg, birth from heat and moisture, and miraculous birth. Since humans in Jambudvipa are primarily born from the womb, this text discusses the suffering of birth from the womb. According to Buddhism, the continuity of a living being's life unfolds through several stages, including the existence of present life, the existence of death, and the intermediate existence. The existence of present life refers to the entire process of this life, from the moment of rebirth to the moment of death. The existence of death refers to the period from being captured by the king of death to the moment of ceasing to breathe. The intermediate existence, also known as the Bardo body or the Gandharva, refers to the transitional stage from the end of this life to the beginning of the next. The Sutra of the Right Mindfulness of Dharma states that the Gandharva is a type of consciousness that encompasses concept-bound clairvoyance, such as knowing others' thoughts. It resembles a dream body that floats and sways. Once driven by karma, the consciousness of a being in the intermediate state must first enter the union of the father's semen and the mother's blood. From this point, it faces the challenging and often painful stages of embryonic development, progressing through various forms such as a round, jelly-like shape, a viscous ellipse, a thick oblong mass, and eventually a firm oval and a hard round lump, and so on. As such, the physical body is formed. Therefore, the body grows from the parent seed of impurity. Does this seed of impurity have an origin? Yes, it does. The body of this life began from the parent seed of impurity, and the bodies of the parents originated from the seed of impurity of their respective parents, and so forth. Generation by generation, this can be traced back to the ancestors of humans. Further back, according to Darwinism, the origin of life starts from a protein that gave rise to single-celled organisms, which gradually evolved into today's animals and humans. Thus, this is the origin of the body. Does consciousness have an origin? Yes, it does. As you know, the self, or I, is merely a conceptual construct formed upon the union of the 5 aggregates, which consist of name and form. Specifically, the name refers to the 4 aggregates of sensation, perception, formation, and consciousness, with consciousness being the primary state of the mind. Consciousness, which is clear and luminous, has always been within every living being. Even if the world we live in is destroyed, consciousness will migrate to other worlds, allowing it to continuously proceed forward. The origin of consciousness is explained in great detail in Anuttara Yoga Tantra, or the highest Yoga Tantra. After a human's consciousness enters the womb, it typically goes through 5 or 7 stages, as clearly outlined in Finding Rest in the Nature of the Mind. Nescient consciousness, the wind mind, gathers in the parent's essences, and step by step, in 7 weeks' time, a body takes its shape, from round to long to oblong shape, egg-like, round and flat, fish-shaped, like a tortoise. Thus its form evolves. This process is clearly outlined in the chapter on teaching to Nanda on entering the womb in the Sutra of the Great Heap of Jewels. At your convenience, please take a look to understand the whole process of how consciousness enters the womb and how the fetus develops. What suffering does the fetus experience? After the limbs, appendages, and sense organs have developed, the fetus, confined within the dark, oppressive, and suffocating environment of the womb, endures suffering akin to imprisonment. While we do not remember our time in the uterus, it is in fact a very painful experience. The uterus is dark and unpleasant, and the fetus is constrained and squeezed, lacking any freedom. When the mother consumes hot food, the fetus experiences pain akin to being scorched by fire. When she eats cold food, it feels as though it has been plunged into icy water. When she lies down, it is as if the fetus is crushed under the weight of a mountain. A full stomach feels like being squeezed between rocks, while hunger resembles the sensation of plummeting from a cliff. When she moves about, the fetus also feels pain, like being swept by a violent wind. The Sutra of the Great Heap of Jewels also states that the fetus suffers greatly when the mother consumes sour, sweet, or other flavors. In his work, The Scientific Proof of Causal Reincarnation, Dr. Zhang Maosen uses modern terminology to explain the sufferings of the fetus. I have read some of his articles and watched his videos, However, the modern medical community mainly studies the sufferings experienced by the mother and seldom addresses the suffering of the fetus. The sufferings of the fetus are discussed in great detail only in sutras, as mentioned in the Sutra of the Great Heap of Jewels. Ananda, you should know that there are various sufferings while staying in the mother's uterus. After residing in the womb for 9 or 10 months, it is time to be born. Of course, there are special cases regarding the duration of pregnancy. For example, Beersheba, a Theravada monk, was in his mother's womb for 60 years. As the pregnancy reaches full term, the energy of karmic existence causes the baby's head to turn downward in preparation for birth. As the baby is pushed toward the cervix, it experiences intense suffering, as if a powerful giant were gripping its legs and slamming it against a wall. When forced through the bony structure of the pelvis, it feels as though it is being pulled through the small opening of a draw plate. If the passage is too narrow, the baby may not survive, and in some cases, both mother and child may lose their lives during labor. Even if they survive, they endure the immense pain akin to the process of dying. There are also many cases of obstructed labor in modern times. In 2009, a 12-year-old pregnant girl in Yemen experienced heavy bleeding due to obstructed labor and died 3 days later, along with her unborn baby. Due to karmic forces, there are many underage marriages in Yemen, with children as young as 8 or 9 years old getting married and divorced. In 2007, a 22-year-old pregnant woman faced difficulties during childbirth and died in a Beijing hospital after her husband refused to consent to a cesarean section. Both she and her unborn baby perished as a result. This case went viral in the media for an extended period. Some argued that the hospital was negligent for requiring a signed document to determine matters of life and death. Others found it extremely absurd that her husband, in a life and death situation, refused to pay for essential medical treatment. Ultimately, both the mother and her unborn baby endured immense suffering. To alleviate pain, many wealthy individuals are willing to spend significant amounts on childbirth. In 2007, a celebrity from Hong Kong booked a 6-star luxury delivery room, which cost over Chinese yuan 1 million for a 7-day stay. Living beings differ significantly in their karmic forces, but regardless of wealth, everyone must confront the excruciating suffering of birth when entering the human realm. Even if one is fortunate enough to survive childbirth, the experience is often akin to suffering close to death. As Padmasambhava says, both mother and child journey halfway to the land of death, and every joint in the mother's body except her jaws is torn apart. Initially, I did not fully understand why all the mother's joints, except her jaw, are wrenched apart during childbirth. Later, I learned that it is indeed the case. A woman who has just given birth experiences loosening of her pelvis, the joints in her limbs and her teeth, so she should avoid exposure to cold wind during the first month postpartum. Otherwise, this may have lasting negative effects on her health. Once, while I was receiving inpatient care, a nurse shared her experience of giving birth. A Tibetan woman might be shy to discuss her childbirth experience, but this nurse recounted the entire process in detail, probably for an hour or two, from her registration at the hospital to the delivery of her twins and her subsequent discharge. Hearing her description, I felt deeply that being a mother is not easy. For mothers, the suffering of birth is not merely a literal description. It is a genuine experience. We have learned that the baby experiences great pain while in the uterus and during delivery. But does the baby continue to suffer after birth? The answer is yes. Everything the baby experiences is filled with discomfort. Landing on the mattress at birth feels like falling into a pit of thorns. Having the crusted slime wiped off its back feels like its skin is being peeled away. Being cleaned feels like being pricked by sharp thorns. Being placed on its mother's lap feels like a fragile bird being snatched up by a hawk. Having butter applied to the crown of its head feels like being bound and thrown into a dark hole. Being laid in the cradle feels like being placed in filthy mud. Whenever the baby suffers from hunger, thirst, illness, or other discomforts, its only response is to cry. Someone once said that an infant crying at the moment of birth is a complaint about the suffering of samsara, and that the last tear a person sheds at the moment of death reflects the suffering of their entire life. From birth to death, a person is in tears. From a medical perspective, an infant crying loudly at birth indicates that they are healthy. While still in the womb, they received oxygen from the mother's blood, which was transferred across the placenta via the umbilical cord. After birth, infants need to breathe with their own lungs. Therefore, the first cry signifies that the newborn's lungs are fully filled with oxygen. If a newborn does not cry at the moment of birth, it may lead to various health issues and chronic complications. Thus, if the newborn cries out loudly, the mother should be relieved. If the newborn has a weak cry, it may indicate a congenital condition. Many of you are listening to me so attentively. You do not behave this way when I teach you the middle way, do you? The audience laughs. From the moment we are born, and as we progress through our youth, it may seem like we are growing and gaining. But in truth, our lives are steadily shortening with each passing day, drawing us closer to death. We become engrossed in an endless stream of ordinary pursuits, one after another, none ever reaching a true resolution, like ripples forming endlessly on water. Since these activities are rooted in negative actions, their inevitable result is lower rebirths and endless suffering. In this world, there are many opportunities for us and others to commit misdeeds, and very few chances to perform good deeds. Even if we want to pursue virtue, our intention is often weak. Today, we may want to follow a teacher and practice diligently, but tomorrow we'll give it up. This has much to do with our habitual tendencies and the external environment. Nevertheless, whatever we are doing, be it walking, sitting, lying down, or the like, we should often reflect on and meditate upon the aforementioned sufferings according to Patrul Rinpoche's Vajra words. Over time, we'll develop a solid understanding of the sufferings in samsara. This, in itself, is practice. According to my observation, a significant majority of Buddhists, not to mention non-Buddhists, are working hard to pursue happiness in this life alone. Although these Buddhists study the Dharma, they rarely reflect on whether they will fall into the lower realms in their next life, and how terrifying the sufferings of birth, old age, sickness, and death can be. It is of little meaning to study and practice the Dharma in this manner. In fact, there is no happiness at all in samsara. If you can truly recognize this from the depths of your heart, it means that your practice of the external preliminaries has been successful.